Ooh, mysterious and clickbaity title, woo. Alright, while I was researching something completely different, I came across a weird little story. It's rather hard to classify, it doesn't really fit into anything else, but it's such a curious tale that I felt that it had to be talked about in a video. To start us off, what's the difference between an underground line and a normal railway? I mean, this is an underground line. This is not an underground line. This used to be an underground line, and now it is an overground line, and before it was an underground line, it was a normal railway. When it comes to the subsurface lines, basically all that makes them underground lines is the fact that we call them underground lines. This ambiguity has resulted in a certain amount of confusion over the years. For example, in 1933, the Metropolitan Railway fought not to be classed as an underground line on the grounds that they were more like a conventional railway. But back in 1923, when the mainline railways were grouped together, they were treated as, well, an underground line rather than a mainline railway. Sort of Schrödinger's tube line. But let's go back even further, back beyond the beginning of the 20th century. Before the London Underground officially existed. At that time, what we now call the District Line was the District Railway. It was an independent company and one that was not doing so well. It had been founded to be folded. That is to say, the railway was nominally independent, but it was very much the brainchild of the Metropolitan. The function of the district was to raise the necessary money and build the southern half of what's now the Circle Line. Having done that, it was to be bought out and folded into the Metropolitan Railway. That did not happen. The Metropolitan and the district fell out, mostly because the district had cost far, far more to build than anticipated, and the Metropolitan didn't fancy taking that on. The district, for their part, were more interested in building lines out to the suburbs than actually completing the Circle Line. The district was left in a precarious position, desperately short of money and on the verge of bankruptcy. In 1870 they brought in a new chairman, James Stats Forbes. Forbes had a lot of experience with railways and a reputation as a troubleshooter. He was a cautious sort of chap, which was what the district needed. At a time when the fashion seemed to be for railways to extend beyond their means, he was happy to take it slow. Which was great at first, but by the 1890s shareholders were wondering when he was going to stop taking it slow and actually, do something. One proposal to get things moving was to build an electric railway, an express line running beneath the existing district line from Mansion House to Earl's Court. Officially part of the district line, but basically its own thing. A rather curious proposal came along from a gentleman named Charles Pond. Pond, along with an organisation known as the Bloomsbury Syndicate, bought £750,000 worth of district railway stock. Then he approached the railway claiming to represent an organisation known as the Metropolitan District Railway Shareholders Association. In reality, this was a front for the syndicate. The association, in quote marks, were offering to finance the electric express line for £1 million cash in exchange for stock. Forbes found the whole thing deeply sus, as did anyone who knew anything about railways. Buying stock in the district was not a gamble likely to pay off any time soon. One of the shareholders was Whittaker Wright, who would later get involved in financing the Bakerloo line, get done for fraud, and take his own life while awaiting trial. Obviously, Forbes didn't know that, but it gives you some idea of the sort of person who was involved in the Bloomsbury Syndicate. It eventually emerged that Pond didn't have any background in railways or engineering. He did have a background in finance, having a great deal of experience in bankruptcy. On the ground, as it were. In fact, Charles Pond was not his real name. He was actually an actor named Zachariah Pattle. He'd changed his name in an effort to escape his debtors. Zachariah Pattle is a pretty great name, but the guy who discovered all this was the stockbroker Wellbore Ellis, so it's just fancy names all around. It seems likely, given how much wheeler-dealing of shares was going on among members of the syndicate, that the real purpose of the exercise was to artificially inflate the value of the district shares, then sell them on at a profit. But we don't know for sure, because Ellis explained the situation to Forbes and paid everyone back. Several members of the syndicate cashed out, and Pond, or Pattle, was left with an enormous amount of stock that was unlikely to turn a profit. So he spent the next couple of years hassling the district railway about not being dynamic enough, which is frankly a bit rich coming from a guy who was so bad at fraud that he couldn't even be arrested. Hello, Jago from the Edit here. As I was putting this together, I discovered Charles Pond's other claim to fame. In 1897, after the failure of his Pondi scheme, he found himself reduced to poverty, performing comic routines and songs at parties. He was so poor that he couldn't even afford a second-hand suit. In desperation, he borrowed a suit from a West End shop for half a guinea a night. That shop was owned by George and Alfred Moss, and that is how Moss Bros got into the suit hire business. No real relevance to this video, but I just thought it was interesting. Anyway, bigger sharks were circling. In 1899, a group of larger railway companies came up with a new plan for the district. When these early underground lines were built, the concept of a metro as we understand it didn't really exist. Lines like the district were fully compatible with conventional railways, and indeed that was part of the draw. They provided routes for other railway companies to use. For a price, of course. 4 of these railway companies figured they could cut out the middleman. These companies were the Great Western Railway, the Great Central Railway, the South Eastern Railway, and the London, Chatham and Dover Railway. They had seen how disgruntled the district's shareholders and directors were, and reckoned if they bought the district railway out, they could use it as a connection between their lines, as well as other railways connected to the district. It was potentially a bargain. As an interesting side note, James Stats Forbes was also the chairman of the London, Chatham and Dover Railway. All this would likely have meant the end of the district line as a separate company. It would have existed on paper, but probably with few, if any, of its own trains. At the same time, though, a smaller shark with bigger teeth had swum into view, by the name of Charles Tyson Yerkes. Yerkes was notorious in Chicago and New York for his con artistry in the field of public transport, and as far as he was concerned, London was a city of new marks. And he basically intended to do the same thing that Mr. Pond had promised to do. Buy the district line up, bring it up to scratch, and then sell it on to some poor sucker. The main difference between Yerkes and Pond, though, was that Yerkes could actually walk the walk. He had built railways. He employed experts. He seems to have scared the other railway companies off, because both Forbes and the other railway companies stopped talking about the takeover shortly after he arrived on the scene. Yerkes and his syndicate formed a company to electrify the district line, then bought the railway itself out. Following this, they got involved in the Hampstead Tube and the Piccadilly Tube, which were having trouble getting finance. They also bought out the Baker Street and Waterloo Railway, which was having problems of its own, with Whittaker Wright playing a not insignificant part in those. They bought out a bunch of other transport providers, including the Central London Railway, the City and South London Railway, London United Tramways, and the London General Omnibus Company, and a whole lot of other companies, some of which only existed on paper. This made them by far the largest transport provider in London, and meant that even where they didn't own companies, they could influence them. For instance, they never owned the Metropolitan Railway, but they were able to strong-arm them into using the same system of electrification as the district because the companies shared the Circle line. I suspect that this is what doomed the Metropolitan to eternally be regarded as an underground line rather than a mainline railway. When London Transport was formed in 1933 as the official transport authority for the city, it was mostly composed of the companies bought out by Yerkes and his successors. And that in turn is the ancestor of the modern Transport for London network. But think about it. If history had gone a little differently, the tube map might look entirely different. Pond might have bankrupted the district, or it might have been bought out by the railway companies. Yerkes would have to look elsewhere for his foothold in Britain. Would he have got involved in the Bakerloo, Hampstead or Piccadilly lines if he couldn't use the district line as evidence that he had what it took? If the district had been bought out by the railway companies, they might not have considered electrification at all. And if this was the case, would the Metropolitan have become a tube line? We might not even have a London Underground today. A lot of this is speculation, of course. The details are murky and much of the evidence is circumstantial. Still, it's hard to deny the small but significant place in transport history of an actor named Zachariah Patel. Well, I hope you enjoyed this well-staged tale from the tube. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I came across this ludicrous set of circumstances in MAC Horn's The District Railway, if you're interested in finding out more. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the fake name to my dodgy syndicate. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.